perhaps impregnate some of them and not have to stick around. There's no obligation to them beyond producing child support payment.
That means that it's advantageous to psychopathic men.
Right, dark triad types.
Well, exactly, because, the hallmark of psychopathy is short-term advantage taken by a given individual without care for anyone else. And it certainly seems to me like dating apps like Tinder. Now, I don't want to call every male who's successful on Tinder a psychopath. I'm not saying that. But I would say that it isn't obvious to me at all that if you're a successful polyamorous male on Tinder, and so that's going to be a very tiny subset of men, they're hyper-selected by women, a tiny subset of men who receive almost no rejection, they're set up to learn to be psychopathic because all their interactions with other people can be devoted to short-term sexual gratification with no emotional intimacy or long-term commitment. And that's a hell of a training ground as far as I'm concerned. It depends on what you want for a society. But as you said, even the affluent women who profess a desire for polyamory, which is complete bloody rubbish in my estimation and completely underestimates the economic consequences of sex, they still dream of the fairy tale princess who meets the prince who, wakes her up with a kiss and are married happily ever after. So it's such bloody nonsense. We allow our culture to be run by the pathetic fantasies of immature adolescent delusion, fundamentally, as far as I can tell.
There was a study I saw, I think it was last year, on this very question of who uses dating apps and sort of their personality traits and so on. And they did indeed find, and these were just university students, which, take it for what it's worth, but the people who were using the dating apps, which is about 1/3 of the students in the sample pool, they were sort of more likely to be interested in short-term sexual conquest, not really surprised, more interested and more likely to use drugs and alcohol, more likely to have sort of callous sexual attitudes. I can't remember the exact term they used for this construct, but basically they were more likely to agree with statements like sex is like a game where one person wins and the other person loses. So if you're using a dating app, you're more likely to say yes to that kind of question. So in a way, I think you're right.
There's a status element to that. I mean, there's the old trope of notches in the bed frame. And among competitive adolescent males, there's no reason, there's every reason to be competitive about how much you can drink and how many people you can lure into bed. I mean, even if you don't necessarily believe that personally, at a deep level, and maybe you suffer for it emotionally to some degree, even though you might obscure that from yourself, it's certainly something to score points with your peers. And there's plenty of that kind of, that competitive bantering in adolescent, especially adolescent male culture. And I mean, it's not surprising to some degree because adolescent males have to figure out how to navigate the sexual landscape. And they're going to do that in all sorts of awkward and finally unproductive ways. It's not an easy thing to bind or to regulate properly. But I mean, these technologies like Tinder is a transformative technology. And it's radically underestimated in terms of its potency because it produces hyper-successful predatory males and reduces rejection. It eliminates rejection because, I mean, you can be totally rejected, in which case you're a failure on Tinder. But in normal pre-mating interaction, let's say, there's a high probability of rejection, especially on the part of males. And that technology... Well,
there's actually research on this.
Yes.
On Tinder.
Yes.
So there's research basically showing that. So on Tinder, women they like, swipe right. They like the profiles of only 4% of the men that they see on the app. Whereas for men, when they see female profiles, they swipe right or like more than 60%. That's 60% of the profiles they see.
So that's really worth concentrating on because that's a great example of hypergamy. Right? So women mate across and up success hierarchies, and men mate across and down. Right. So, and the women like men who are about 4 years older, cross-culturally. They like men who manifest signs of success, as well as being handsome and personable and all of that. And the reason for that, as far as I can tell, is that they're looking to equalize the economic disparity that exists because women take a harder hit from sex and pregnancy than men. So they're looking to equalize that. And no wonder they're looking for someone who's competent. This is for long-term mating, who's competent and generous, right? You want both of those. So competence would be intelligence, general cognitive ability, and the markers that go along with that. They want conscientiousness or openness, as well as other desirable personality traits. And they want generosity, honesty, all of those. But so they're looking for someone who can provide. Well, it's not because they're greedy precisely. It's because, well, they're going to put themselves in a more vulnerable position if they have a child. And we know this because even affluent women who have a child by themselves or who get divorced tend to drop down the socioeconomic hierarchy a fair bit, which is, of course, why alimony payments and all of that are necessary. So this hypergamy means women are much more selective in their mating than men are, and that's true cross-culturally. And it's not surprising because they pay a bigger price for sex. It's more dangerous for women because they can get pregnant, and it might be more dangerous emotionally as well. And I believe that would be a reflection of their higher levels of agreeableness and higher levels of negative emotionality. So women do put themselves at risk more, and that might be why there's such a intense debate about what constitutes consent on campuses, despite these beliefs in polyamory and all of these things. But so anyways, on Tinder, as you said, women select 4% of the men.
Yep.
So that means,
and I would imagine that 4% is very high up on what you're calling, the success hierarchy. I have a friend, a good-looking guy. He was very active on Tinder for a while, and he accumulated more than 20,000 matches on the app.
20,000.
20,000. And he was so successful that Tinder pinpointed him early on and gave him all kinds of free perks and bonuses and lifted his radius restrictions, gave him the Tinder Gold app or whatever version of it, basically trying to entice him to continue to use the app. Yeah, they wanted to entice him.
This is so amazing.
They never want you to leave.
These are unbelievably pernicious and vicious broad-scale social experiments that are far more potent than anything like government policy.
Well,
he's in Genghis Khan territory with 20,000.
I don't know if he slept with all 20,000.
Yeah, well,
maybe
my
10,000.
suspicions are he tried. And I know that
he'll get a kick out of that.
That records for like athletes, for example, and movie stars, there's some of the men have reportedly slept with thousands of women. Yes, Wilt Chamberlain, and there's others who are in the same category. But they're men who have women throwing themselves at them all the time, lining up for them. And I've read biographies of people who had that sort of thing happen as well.
But that's not the typical male experience.
The typical male experience is all rejection. Nothing. Exactly.
Right. They might get a couple matches a week.
Right. So you see what's happening is that Tinder is one of the forces that's transforming monogamy into polygamy. And the problem with polygamy is that it follows a Pareto distribution, like the distribution of wealth, is that some tiny minority of men get all the sexual opportunity and all the rest get virtually none. And that is a recipe for social instability. I mean, that
sort of deregulation of romantic relationships, whereas in the past it was expected for you to have one partner and over time settle down, whereas now it's a total free-for-all. I mean, there are aspects to this that a lot of people don't think about. I mean, I talk to young people, so I have younger friends who I talk to who are sort of very active on the apps and in sort of the dating scene, and they'll tell me things like it's even easier to cheat. So in the past, if you wanted to be unfaithful to your partner, it was risky because, essentially like you had the same social circle, you had the same friends, everyone knew everyone else. But now with the apps, you can match with someone who is completely outside of your social reality, outside of your partner's social reality. You can have a very discreet rendezvous. No one will ever know about this. Ghosting has become more common. I don't know if you know about ghosting, but it's basically where you're in a relationship with someone, and after you have sex, once or however many times, then you just vanish. You never see that person again. Delete them from your phone, block them on social media. You never have to see them again. And there's no social cost to this.
That's a real psychopathic conquest strategy.
Yes.
Right. Yes. Because the psychopaths, they tend to form relationships that are very predatory and then disappear. Mm-hmm. Because that way their reputations stay intact as long as they can continue to disappear.
But I'm interested in what you had said before about whether this is actually sort of cultivating psychopathy in young people and young men, where, in the past, typically a psychopath would do that on their own. But now with the apps and the technology, removing all of the friction from, breaking up with someone or having to communicate with someone that you no longer want to see them, I think a lot of people who ghost others, they're not even thinking in those terms. They're not thinking, I want to maliciously hurt this person, or I don't care about this person. It's like, it's easy. You press a few buttons on your smartphone and you can move on to the next conquest. And I think a lot of people wouldn't act that way otherwise.
Well, the question would be, what happens to you after you do that 4 or 5 times? Let's say you're not particularly psychopathic to begin with. It's like you learn what you practice. And I would say, look, if you're using people continually as a means to an end, and I think sex is probably the most effective way of doing that, then you're establishing a pattern of interaction between you and other people at perhaps the deepest possible level. And so if you do that repeatedly, first of all, you're certainly not engaging in anything that might be regarded as a meaningful or deep relationship. Quite the contrary, you regard that as excess baggage. That's an impediment to your next conquest, so to speak. So how would that not? I mean, now you said there was research on Tinder. Has there been research on the relationship between the dark triad and these hyper-successful men?
Well, I've seen research on dark triad and Tinder use, and people who are high on dark triad do tend to be more successful, accumulate more partners. Specifically, whether this is related to gender and whether men are more successful or more likely to hurt others using these apps, I haven't seen anything on that. I have interestingly seen, I think this was from Pew, where they broke down the data by education level. And they asked people questions like, have you ever been harassed on this dating app? Have you ever met someone on a dating app who inflicted physical harm on you? Basically, the wide variety of negative experiences through using dating apps. And they found that people who are not college graduates were far more likely, the women were far more likely to report negative experiences on the dating apps compared to college educated women. And to me, this is also indicative of this, this sort of social class divide. Another manifestation of the luxury belief of sexual promiscuity, where you introduce these dating apps, you have no idea what's going to happen or how this is going to warp society and how people are going to interact in romantic relationships, and it's disproportionately harming lower educated, lower income women who are, like you're saying, they're probably more likely to meet psychopaths. They're probably perhaps less adept in some ways at screening for certain kinds of guys. The other thing is,
well,
and
especially if they're single mothers, because
right. Well, yeah.
Well, they're a lot easier to prey upon. I mean, their straits are a lot more desperate, and they've knocked themselves out of the single girl dating market and lowered their market value, so to speak. I hate to speak of it in terms like that, but it's clearly the case, because to initiate a relationship with a woman who has a child already is to initiate a relationship that has a lot higher upfront cost. The complexity of negotiating the relationship with the child, the additional responsibility that has to be taken on instantly. And none of that's the least bit trivial. So that means, and we know that in general, if you do imagine a triangular representation of a social hierarchy on any valued dimension, the people who are at the lowest level are those who are most susceptible to any sort of destructive tendency that comes whistling through. They don't have as much social support. They're a lot closer to abject poverty. They don't have the broad social network or the opportunities. So everything affects them disproportionately, including epidemic illnesses. And it's the case throughout the kingdom of life that low status confers vulnerability. Oh, that's why people go for higher status, at least in part. Yeah, so right. the Tinder, I mean, I don't know how widespread Tinder use is. I don't know that much about Tinder, but when I first found out about it, I thought this is a technology that, well, they certainly named it properly, because Tinder starts fires, and it's a fire starter, and not just sexually. And
something like 40%, last I saw, something like 40% of people under 30 are using the apps. I would imagine it's probably higher now, especially in the wake of COVID. So the data that I saw collected, I think, in 2019, but after COVID and the pandemic and the lockdowns, there's no other way to meet people. So I'd imagine a lot more people download those apps, and we'll see if they wean themselves off or if they're hooked. I mean, these tech companies use very manipulative strategies. I talked to an executive, I won't say which dating app this was, but he told me that some dating apps will basically what they call, I think they're called seeding, where they'll put fake profiles of very attractive, usually women, right? Because men are actually more likely to use dating apps, and they're sort of more likely to pay for the premium profiles compared to women who don't have to, because they're going to get matches anyway. So anyway, the dating app companies, they'll seed them with fake attractive women profiles and intentionally match with men who have recently downloaded a new profile, basically newly created one. And the idea here is that if they download the app and they immediately match with an attractive woman, and then they usually have a couple of conversational exchanges like, hey, how's it going? Good. How are you? And then that's it. The robot no longer responds to the user. But the reason why this is done is basically to give them a little hit, right? It gives them, it's like drugs.
It's
give them a little boost, and now they're hooked.
It's a major hit. You bet. It's a major hit. Yeah, yeah.
And so basically they called it chasing the dragon, which is basically a term from drug usage, right? From heroin. You give them a little hit, and then they're going to be chasing that high for the rest of their lives. So, I think that there's so many complexities to this. It is. And they are creating a lot of heartbreak and a lot of frustration.
Wait till the AI people get all over that.
Well,
because you can imagine if you're interacting with someone fake, I mean, that can be tailored to your desire. All you'd have to do is look at the pictures that someone was looking at and produce a composite that's an amalgam of those attractive women, let's say, and that the possibility for manipulation is almost infinite. And you won't say which dating app. That's too bad, because they deserve the exposure. But, I understand your reticence. That's really unbelievably appalling and malevolent.
Well, I will say that if one app is doing it, then that means more than likely they all are. So it almost doesn't even matter. They're probably all doing some version of that, because that's how they get users. Right.
Yeah. So, well, it's not that clever an idea. It's a pretty obvious idea in a very crooked and horrible sort of way. So it's not like it would take a genius to think it up.
Yeah. Yeah. And so this idea of, and I wanted to go back. So this idea of differently educated women, different social classes having different experiences on the dating apps. Well, they're also having entirely different experiences in the real world too, in terms of their dating and romantic relationships after the erosion of marriage, after the sort of deteriorating norms around dating and romance. If, I talked to some people from my hometown, for example, and I think about, the kinds of guys who stayed behind, who didn't go off to college, who didn't join the military, who just sort of languished and hung around there. These are not, just to put it bluntly, these are not, it's not Prince Charming. And so when women are dating these men and there's no social norms, no forces constraining them, many of them act very poorly. A lot of alcoholism, a lot of drug use, verbal and sometimes physical abuse, emotional abuse. A lot of these guys who sort of are not so educated, don't have a lot of money, not a lot of life prospects, when they get involved with a woman, they don't necessarily treat her very well. Whereas, in the past, I think that there were stronger norms around how you're supposed to treat the opposite sex and how you're supposed to interact with them, date them, what's expected of you, and so on. I think with the sort of dissolution of expectations has come a lot more trouble for lower income young women.
Yeah, hypothetically, the ones that the progressives are trying to do something for. Removing the constraints of patriarchal relationships, for example. The question always is, what flows in when you remove the dikes, right? I mean, that's another problem, I suppose, in some sense, that's analogous to the protection of social class, is many of these institutions that are so casually criticized, we don't know what forces shape them. So, I've been pilloried in the press repeatedly for pointing out that normative monogamy controls male aggression. Now, it's amazing to me that I've been slashed to ribbons for making that case, because I thought that was like Anthropology 101. So, there's two things that every society needs to control, and one is female fecundity because of its high cost, and the other is male aggression. It's like, well, I thought everyone knew that if they were even moderately educated. And, well, how do you control that, regulate it for everyone's interest, particularly for the interest of children? The answer seems to be the imposition of monogamous norms. Now, people object, well, are people truly monogamous? And the answer is not if you set up the environment to differentially award hyper-successful polyamorous males, which is exactly what Tinder does. And there are societies where that's the case, where one man has 1,000 wives, so to speak, and 999 men have none. But those aren't societies that are stable, and those young men who have nothing to do find things to do, and they aren't necessarily the sorts of things that you want them to be doing, because what the hell do they have to lose fundamentally? And it's not a good idea to generate a society full of young men who have very little to lose. So and it is an appalling thing that the privileged classes are more likely to disparage marriage, let's say.
And these ideas trickle down over time. They sort of permeate throughout society because elites, affluent, educated people wield disproportionate influence, whether it's through media, pop culture, fashion.
Do you know, here's something cool.
Yeah.
So do you know that names drift down the social hierarchy?
Huh. What? I haven't heard this before.
So influential upper class people will produce a name for their child, and then that name gets popularized all the way down the social hierarchy until it becomes passé, and becomes more and more common as it drifts down. So this influence that you're describing, you can measure it everywhere. They're the fashion leaders. They're on the cutting edge, and everyone imitates. And so
yes. And I think that, so of course, like actual fashion, clothing, of course, the sort of trendsetters, and then it trickles down to everyone else. I didn't know this about names, which is really interesting, but I think it is also for sort of moral beliefs as well. One idea that I've sort of been playing with, maybe this is, a little bit dangerous for me to say, but I've been thinking about this, who was championing sort of colorblindness, integration, this idea that, we should treat everyone on their merits and so on. I mean, whatever, 50 or 60 years ago, this was a very progressive idea, and it was mostly championed by highly educated people, more affluent people. They also tended to lead the abolitionist movement in the US and so on. But more recently, things have changed. So my idea here is that in the past, the elites had this idea of colorblindness. Over time, that idea trickled throughout society. Such that now today, if you talk to a typical middle class or working class Western person, they do tend to basically believe in colorblindness. The racial attitudes are basically like, who cares? And it's not an important thing in their lives. And so now that the elites have spread this belief, how do they once again distinguish themselves from the hoi polloi, from those middle and working class people? They once again have to make race an important feature of our social reality. So now I have to
comment about your theory there for a sec, if you don't mind.
Sure.
When Francis Galton, 150 years ago, started studying, he thought about it as excellence, something like that. I mean, some of the IQ research came out of that. He started to measure people on a whole variety of different dimensions. But his conception of excellence, of superiority, let's say, wasn't so much cognitive capacity, the more differentiated sorts of things that we might measure today and associate with some degree of value: conscientiousness, creativity, intelligence. Galton, who was an English aristocrat, which is the reason I'm bringing this up, was at the forefront of that movement. And he believed, like most English aristocrats of his time, that England was a superior culture and that English aristocrats were the hallmark of English superiority, right? And so, but